Welcome to Around the Girdle Earth, the podcast where Dartmouth stories come to life. I'm your host, Yovany Jerez, class of '03, and on each episode, we'll sit down with members of the Dartmouth alumni community to explore the moments, the mentors, and the memories that shaped them, from the green to the great unknown. Whether it's been a year and a half or a lifetime since Hanover, we all have stories worth telling. And these conversations are where they come to life. So grab your favorite drink, step into the story, cue up the nostalgia, and let's wonder together. Today, our very special guest is Eduardo Fernandez, class of 1993, who's actually dialing us all the way from France. And before we get into how you got into France, Eduardo, why don't you help us take us all the way back? Give us a little context about your family background, where you grew up, high school. Give us a little more context from the beginnings of your story.
Sure, Giovanni. Nice to meet you, and great to have this conversation. Looking forward to it. So way back when, and it's starting to get you know really back when, as every year it adds another year back when. I was born in New York, and then my parents moved fairly quickly to Havana on the Hudson, as people like to call it, Hudson County, New Jersey, where at the time there was a very large Cuban-American community, and now it's a smaller but very Hispanic area of northern New Jersey. And my mom came from Cabayguan in Cuba, and she met my dad in Spain, in Madrid. My dad is Gallego. He comes from a rural part of Galicia, Lugo, and had made his way down to the big city as a young man, and they met in 1968. And my mom, after a very whirlwind romance, after about a month, they got married. They got married, and then my mom promptly took off and went to the U.S. And my dad was stuck in Spain because you couldn't just pick up and go at the time. And then he picked up and went in 1969, and by 1971 I came around, and then my younger sister, was born a couple years after that. So we grew up in Union City first, and then West New York. I went to public school there, including the public high school, Memorial High School, the Tigers, class of '89. And so, yeah, that was it. It's a great place to grow up. I still have childhood friends that I see on a fairly regular basis. And it was a very interesting, informative period growing up.
Yeah, I've had to learn that part of history as well about our Cuban community right after that 80-81 stage, right, that exodus. A lot of them landed in Miami, but yeah, there's also in Jersey, right, in the Havana of the Hudson. I love that reference.
Yeah.
And actually, I'm calling from LA, from Los Angeles, and there's also, that was the third highest concentration of Cubans after that exodus. So in other words, you were surrounded by a lot of Latino and part of that Cuban community. So you grew up speaking Spanish, or was it mainly English?
I think it's interesting. I grew up speaking Spanish at home for the simple reason that my mother didn't speak English. She could get by on this, going to the local butcher shop or supermarket, especially if there were Italian Americans in that neighborhood as well. And so with Italian Americans that had some notions of Italian, the Italian and Spanish, and body language, they got by. But at home, we spoke Spanish. And my dad was adamant about that. He was always adamant about, even though he spoke English, he wanted to speak Spanish at home. So the home language was Spanish. And then I learned English, like most of my friends at the time, Sesame Street first. And then you get to, kindergarten, or there was no preschool at the time, but kindergarten, and you kind of learn it on the fly. But, Sesame Street was great. I mean, the electric company and all that. Public
Yeah.
television helped us get the notions, but at home, yeah, we spoke. And then as you grow up, it's pure Spanglish. I mean, when you grew up in a community that's, more than 75% Hispanic, everybody speaks Spanish, including the non-Hispanics. They know
Sure.
enough to get by because they all have buddies who everybody's got a grandmother, right? So, if you go over to somebody's house and the grandmother's going to talk to you in Spanish, whether you're American or, Cuban or whatever you are. So all my non-Cuban, non-Hispanic friends spoke some Spanglish. So that's
So I
that's
wonder, how did education come into your consciousness? Was it your parents championing it? Was it the
yeah.
community? Like how
Yeah,
did you even discover Dartmouth?
okay, so the education was a big thing in my house. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was a doctor in Cuba. My uncle was a doctor in Cuba. So my mother's family, there was a big accent put on education, and my dad also had done, for someone coming from a very modest rural background, had studied quite a bit, and it was also, big on, education, and they viewed it, typical immigrant story. I mean, they viewed education as a springboard to success, right? Like you're not going to make it in this country if you don't speak well and if you're not educated. And then from my Cuban grandfather, who I had, the privilege of meeting and spending a little bit of time with before he passed. He never left Cuba, but he came to visit and then wanted to go back. And it was very painful for my mother because, she spent many, many years without seeing her parents. And when she finally saw them, they didn't want to leave their homeland because, my grandfather said to her, I want to die in my house, right? But he said to me, he said, look, and this stayed with me throughout. He said, there's two things that, material things can always be taken from. And there's two things that can never be taken from someone, and it's what they have here and what they have here. So it's your knowledge and your dignity, and that's always been a line and so yeah, so there was that little bit of pressure, right? My mother was the prototypical Ashkenazi Jewish mother from another life. A lot of guilt. Look at all I've sacrificed. You better get your shit together and make sure you do all right. And there was, some criminality in my neighborhood. There still is, probably a little bit more now than there was then. There was always pandillas and people you didn't want to. So they were very adamant about, knowing who I was hanging out with, right? Like who were the kids that I was friends with. I think they didn't understand, that they underestimated the importance of being friends with some delinquents, because that can get you out of a bind every now and then. And that was typically the grade school, right? You were in grade school with whoever you were in grade school with. And then when you got older, your friends tended to be people with, like interests. And so my friends tended to be fairly good students, athletes, not the kind of kids getting in a lot of trouble. But the kids that did get in trouble, I knew from grammar school. And, I'd help them out with the homework assignment every now and then. So I had some goodwill with them, and that was always helpful. But that's how, so yeah, we were focused on doing all right in school. I also had a sense of responsibility from a very young age because my younger sister had Down syndrome. My mother was an older mother. She was already 38 when I was born. And when my sister was born, she was in her early 40s. And so that's as often is the case, or was the case at the time. Older mothers, they tended to be more Downs cases. This is the very, first wave of people actually realizing that people with Down syndrome can live full lives. They don't need to be institutionalized. So my parents were actually fairly avant-garde in that they never, ever thought of my sister as anything as a full child like any other child, and, that couldn't do certain things, but we were going to push the envelope on what she could do and focus on what she could accomplish. But I had that sense of, hey, at the end of the day, my parents will disappear one day, and this is someone I'll be taking care of. And so that added a little bit of, yeah, you screw around, but at the end of the day, you have to do something positive with yourself, because you don't have the luxury of just being able to, wander off into the sunset.
So how did Dartmouth come into the picture?
So Dartmouth, I was in Memorial High School, which is a good public high school. It's probably one of the better public high schools, or urban high schools, in the state of New Jersey at the time. I think it still is. And I had the plan laid out. I was getting, full rides at a bunch of state schools. I could have gone to any state school in New Jersey. I got a free ride at St. Peter's College in Jersey City. So my dad, was Jesuit. It was, it's free. His accent on it was free. On top of it, I could stay at home because it was down in Jersey City. I could take the bus, Kennedy Boulevard, down to campus every day. So for him, it was, it was ideal. Obviously, for me, it was not the ideal plan. And so I was thinking, I applied to some other schools, mostly based on college basketball. So Villanova had a great basketball team when I was about 13 or 14. So I decided that was a place I'd never heard of it otherwise, didn't know where it was, but I applied to Villanova. That was the kind of, great strategy on picking schools at the time. I didn't have any counselors or, people that you get paying to help me with the SAT and all that stuff. But I did have good teachers, and one of them came to me one day and had a brochure. And he said, look, this is a great school. They have trouble getting minority students, and they're looking to add more minority students. And I said, what do you mean minority students? And I looked around. I was not in the minority. And it was actually another teacher who told us one day, next year most of you are going to realize, or a lot of you are going to realize when you go off someplace else, that you are in a minority in this country. You are not the majority. So get it, be ready for that shock. Little would I know that I would be in that group and that the shock would be considerable. But yeah, my physics high school teacher gave me the brochure, said, look it up. And I think you get in, you could get in, so apply. And so I did, and I was waitlisted, and then I got in off the waitlist. And so then that gives rise to a very funny interaction, because my mother was, a wise woman, very modern for her generation. And she said, this is a great opportunity. And so she put the pressure on my dad and saying, look, this is a game changer. This is a very elite place. And this is another, the kind of thing that you should be encouraging him rather than focusing on, the cost or the fact that he's far away and all that. And he said, well, all right. So he agreed to visit. So I did a campus visit. Now, most people, when they go visit, I grew up again just outside New York City. It's a 4.5 hour drive. Most people would stay on campus, arrange for a visit with a student. No, we got up in the morning, we drove there, we did a campus tour. He said to me, and I'll just divert to Spanish for a second here. He said, bueno, ya lo vimos. So now we've seen it. We got back in the car. And we drove back. And so we had a very full day in the car together. The one thing that my father retained from this trip was his annoyance at a speeding ticket that he got in Massachusetts, which he thought was fundamentally unfair because he was barely above 55. He thought there was a little leeway there. And, so that was the one thing that he retained. And he's like, yeah, it's fine. So my reaction was very different, as you could imagine. I got there and it was like a movie set. If you said, I want, now with AI, you would say, AI, I want you to give me a set of a college campus. You would get Hanover, right? The green, the buildings, the whole thing. And it was like a sunny day on top of it. It was love at first sight.
Wow.
It wasn't snowing. It wasn't windy. But yeah, it was amazing. And I said, wow, this is a great place. And so now we put, it was convincing my dad that this was something that I should do, because at the time it wasn't need blind. And, my father had done okay. Like he just retired officially. He said he retired. He's 81, he still works, and he had his own business. He worked on his own. And so he made enough money for us to be middle class. And, it wasn't, it was too much for us to be legitimate poor and not enough for him to be able to pay a Dartmouth tuition. So that was the consideration. And so, again, it was an investment in the future, not just my future, but I think in mine, he was thinking of my sister as well. So it was an interesting thing, but yeah, I got there and I was like, wow, this place is amazing.
Yeah, that's super rich. And so it was love at first sight. You got pulled by the architecture. You got pulled by the carefully curated weather of your visit, of course.
Yeah, that 1 hour, it was beautiful.
That 1 hour, yeah. So tell us about your your Dartmouth experience is 4 years. Like, it's you playing sports. I see that you did history. Like,
Yeah. So I got there. The beginning was rough. The beginning was rough for a number of reasons. First of all, the freshman trip, or it was in the mountains, running around the mountains. You don't do camping where you're from. There was no camping in my family, right? So it was okay. This is weird. I hadn't gone to the bathroom in 5 days. I was gonna have like an eruption by the time I got home. So I was holding out this thing in the woods. No, this one. And then I got to campus, and I remember this image of my dad's, Chrysler New Yorker, 1983 Chrysler New Yorker pulling away. And I was like, oh man, I was in the new dorms. What was the new dorms at the time in Andres Hall, and the car pulling away off of West Wheelock, East Wheelock. And I was like, oh man, they're gone. And now I'm alone. And I don't, I met a couple people on the first year trip, but that's it. And it seemed like, I remember that first feeling of like everybody knew somebody. Everybody was either they'd gone to high school together, prep school, or they were in sports teams together or something. So yeah, that was that feeling of, wow, what did I get myself into? At the beginning was rough, and I got lucky. I landed in a quad. I had my own bedroom, which was great, but I was in a quad, and the other guys in the quad, especially these two guys who shared a room, that were two sport athletes from middle class backgrounds, Boston area, and they were great. And through them, we got along great, and through them, I met a bunch of people on the floor, and then I had my crew, and it was all guys from like middle class backgrounds, some Irish, some Italian American, whatever. But we had that kind of, we were into sports, you were into, you didn't come from this crazy background, and so it was very easy to make that connection, and then from there, you conquer the world, right? It's like
how many
got your group.
how many Latinos were recruited or on campus at that point?
So it's hard to say, because I was involved in the affinity group at the time, but it was actually an interesting mix. And I had a very good friend who was a Dominican from Washington Heights. We had another buddy who was Puerto Rican from New York. So those are the people that had the backgrounds that were most similar to mine. And then we had Latin American students, and I'm actually very friendly with one of them still. But they had, totally different backgrounds, but Spanish speaking. And so we're all lumped together. And then we had people who were like, from other parts, like Bridgeport, Connecticut. I think off the top of my head, you had what I call the hidden Cubans, the ones with, Anglo-sounding names. There's one who's a congressman in my class. And so you're not sure, I couldn't tell you how many of those there were, but we're maybe 20.
Wait, are you talking about Alex Mooney?
Yes, Alex is in my class, yes. So we had maybe 20, 25 in our class. And then, very quickly, there are different mindsets. So my mindset was, I'm here, I gotta figure out the lay of the land, and I gotta adapt, right? So because I was friends with these guys, and our the thing we kind of was the nucleus was the sports, and then I met a lot of athletes, and so through those guys, a lot of those athletes were in the same 2 or 3 fraternities, and I felt welcome in those fraternities, so I had no issue rushing a fraternity, and so that was unusual for Latinos at the time. There weren't many Latinos in the frats, right? And so you had a couple of Spanish guys, a couple of Portuguese guys from Boston, but there weren't that many. I was not there to protest. I was not there to feel oppressed. And so there was a discourse there with some of the people who now have gone on to do things like academia, for example, but that this was and I had a conversation with it. I was like, look around, are you kidding me? I was like, when you're back home, maybe you're oppressed there because you're oppressed by crime rates and poverty and spatially ugly, places. But here, this is a dreamland. What are you talking about? Because there's no frijoles in the store, you're oppressed. Are you kidding?
You were just hungry. You were just hungry for the opportunity that was being presented to you, and you were
Yeah,
just like, was
I was
augmented.
there.
And
I was there to make the most of this place, right, and try
yeah,
to understand how the rest of the world worked. And in that my teacher's little statement about you're a minority, it hit me. It was like, yeah, you're right. And so, what are you going to do? Go back home? If you want to feel comfortable, go home, right? And
yeah,
be totally comfortable. But you necessarily out of your comfort zone, and that's where the self-discovery and the growth happens, right? When you're out of your comfort zone. And so I was very quickly, at a very young age, out of my comfort zone. I was homesick. I thought, my God, what a mistake at times. And at times I was just thrilled, right? And it was just a lot of fun. And then, my dad was pretty strict growing up. My mother was a pain in the ass. So, going out and whatever was always a challenge. Here, you're just like left to your own device. Man, there was a period that first term. It was when I got my grades from that first term. I was
you
like, oh,
almost flunked, didn't you?
yeah, I was that close to getting kicked out. I was like, yeah, I better get my act together. So
I
thankfully, it
think
got better.
it's just it's just it's so funky to hear your story, how it relates to mine as well. Right, my first 2 semesters, I think I spend more time doing social activities than academics. And then I was like, all right, I gotta get it together. I gotta reset, and I gotta, get back. I could do both, but like I gotta prioritize academics first and then social.
Yeah, no,
So yeah,
I think it's, you're there to do a job, essentially. It's the way I think
yeah.
about it. It's, what's your primary job? So later in life, you're going to have a job. So this is your job, is to, you're here for a reason. And
So
then,
so
it was interesting.
so you did government
Yes.
at an undergrad, and then you know you went right into law school. You didn't
Yeah,
even wait. You didn't go to any experience. You were like, you know what? I'm going right
yeah.
into
So,
NYU.
I did government. I took some history classes, and those were the ones that, stuck with me the most. Again, I think the maternal influence. So I had you know, actually a unique thing, which was I was done early. And so I was done a term early. So my senior spring, I had a choice between sticking around Hanover, hanging out, doing nothing, uh, having, a good time probably, or working. And so, the fact of the matter was that I needed to make money, and that I had applied to law school. I wasn't sure that's what I wanted to do. And I had an offer at AT&T to go full time, but it was in Texas. It was part of their management training program. So had it been in New York, I probably would have taken it. But going to Texas, I was like, heem high. And then not against, I have nothing against Texas. It's just it was far away from home, and all of the law schools that I applied to were in the Northeast. So it was either DC, Philly, or New York, and urban centers. I wanted to go back to live in a city, and so I wound up going to Debevoise and Plimpton, which is a law firm, and being what they called project assistants, which were basically legal assistants on short-term projects. And so you had 3 months. They loved Dartmouth students, and so there was a lot of Dartmouth students there, or former Dartmouth people in the ranks. And so I did that, and I met a bunch of people that I'm still friends with. So it was a great experience. But I was, so I was. And then why did I go to law school? Again, the maternal influence or pressure, because my mother had a view of a world where there was only 3 professions, and the rest of everything else was a job. So she wanted me to have a profession. You were either a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, and I sucked at math. So it was that automatically left lawyer, right? And that was that. So I went to law school at NYU, which was interesting choice because the reason I went to NYU was I met a couple of Cubans, and we're everywhere. What can I tell you? Including a guy who I'm still very friendly with today. He was a couple of years ahead. He said, "Look, man, if you come here, you're not going to clerk for the Supreme Court, but if you just, you got to get the B average, and then every now and then just kind of hit that golden ring, get a B plus here, A minus there. Just show that you're capable of, going just a little bit above, and you'll get a job." All the Wall Street firms love to hire people from NYU. So you may be interested in other stuff. You may get into human rights law or, whatever. Unless you want to be an academic. If you want to be an academic, don't come here. But if you want to get a job in the city, it's the place to be. And I thought that's very good advice. So that's exactly what I want is a job, because I have a lot of debt that I need to pay down. And so that's how I wound up at NYU. And it was a great choice. I made, again, just wound up super smart, surrounded by really smart people, which was, everybody seemed to be really, really smart. And I was just like, oh man, this is going to be rough. That B+ thing is going to be tough.
No, and honestly, what you're saying is exactly the spirit of this podcast. It's just like, more stories of folks like you and myself to see who else we could inspire, right? Just like this two Cubans that inspire you into law school, into NYU, and gave you some real talk, right? About like, this is what you could expect, like, calibrate and expect, and then make it happen. So it seems like you've been working for Wilkie Farr and Gallagher for a while. Tell us about that journey and where you are today.
Yeah, so Wilkie, I wound up interviewing at Wilkie because of, you interview basically everywhere, right? Like you go on campus and then you see where there's stickiness. And the guy who interviewed me, my campus interview, was kind of out there. He was an interesting character. And Wilkie was representing Major League Baseball. It was a big client of Wilkie's at the time. And so he asked me some baseball related questions because I love baseball. I played some, whatever. And so then, it went well enough that I got a call back. And I got an offer from that. And once I had the offer in hand, they invite you to a bunch of events. And I just met people. I thought, man, these people, like, they seem normal. Like they, I'm sure they're really smart and whatever, but they seem like normal people. So I liked it, and I summered there. And then the one thing is that Wilkie didn't have an established Latin American practice. And so I really wanted to do Latin America work because it was I figured it was a great way to visit countries in the region, use the Spanish. So it's a differentiating factor for me. And yeah, so I was like, all right, I had my Wilkie offer and I was going to interview we're at the beginning of the third year, but my mom passed away. And so when my mom passed away, I was not interested in interviewing anywhere. I had my offer, and a bunch of Wilkie people showed up at her funeral, which was really unexpected. And the funeral in the hood on top of it. So it was really unexpected. And so I thought, this place is really nice. And each time that there's been, bad things are going to happen to you, right? Like in life, bad happen. It's not that's part of it. And each time that there's been something bad that happened, the firm as an institution have responded really well. And so I said, let me go there. I like the people. And after about 2 months, I wanted to quit. I thought, this is horrible. And it's one of the things that surprises you. It's like, all right, you did an Ivy League school, you went to a good law school, things are going to get easier now. No, they're not. They're going to get harder. And so after 2 months, I was like, I'm a slave, and I'm doing glossary cross checks. Like, what the hell? I have all this education, and I'm like, proofreading glossaries. This is not the way it should be going. And you have to stick it out. And so I stuck it out. I looked at it as my delinquent friend reference came back to me. I said, all right, you have a bunch of debt. Making a move right now just will look horrible on a CV, right? You didn't stick it out at least a couple of years. So you got to do 2 years. So imagine you're so-and-so and you got caught doing something you shouldn't be doing, and they put you away for 2 years. You're going to do your 2-year sentence. That's it. You're doing your 2-year sentence. Well, lo and behold, I was doing my 2 years. Now I'm on 30 years. So my sentence has been kicked out, because, no good deed goes unpunished. I met a couple, again, the relationships and finding people who extend a hand. I met a couple partners who really looked out for me. And then one of them said, hey, you want to have longevity in this game, you got to manage it a little bit. You can't go full court press all game long. You have to manage it. And so you have to hide. You have to learn how to, pick assignments and get out of assignments and things like that. And one of the things you can do is go abroad, because he had done it. And so he said, go to, we have an office in Paris. We have a very small office in London. So why don't you go over there? I was like, the French. It's like, I have no affinity for the French, zero. Well, why would I go to Paris? And then London, it was faster famine because you had one partner, one associate. That was the setup at the time. So you knew you were going to get crushed or you're going to have nothing to do. So I can live with that for a couple of years. The partner who was running the office was good guy, a Dartmouth guy, Bill Dye, class of 77. He was in school with Jose Fernandez, you know. And so I said, I'll do London. And then I was dating somebody. And that woman happens to be French. And she happens to be going to Paris with her firm. We had met at the end of law school. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I went in, saw Tom Cherubino, who's still our chairman, now our chairman. At the time, he was the guy responsible for allocating people. And I said, hey, I want to go to Paris instead of London. Is that doable? And he said, oh, why? And I explained why. He said, yeah, the likelihood of you getting a job is far outweighs the likelihood of you finding another girlfriend. So I totally get it. And off I went. And I had to learn French at Berlitz. I tried, and anyway. And that was how I wound up in Paris. And then I the office at the time did a lot of LBO work. We still do a lot of private equity work. And I stuck with a couple of the big partners at the time. They found something that I could be useful with. And when the time came to go back, it was a real sort of watershed moment, because it was, on the one hand, going back to what I knew, being closer to my family, my friends, and all that. And on the other hand, I got married, I had a son. I was like, and I hacked the lifestyle in New York. Like, that is really intense. Do I want to go back to that level of intensity? And I had, the downside of that choice, again, taking a path and one of the quotes that is a quote that I always think about. And this is like, so there was one path which was the more, rational one. And there was one that was like, all right, take a risk on yourself. Like, are you going to be able to stick it out? And what's the progress going to be? What's the next step ever going to be here? But I did that, and, as fate would have it, inertia is a very powerful force in physics. And so inertia has kept me here, and I'm still here. And, I've gotten different responsibilities. I made partner. I figured out how to get clients, or whatever, got lucky. And then got responsibilities along the way. And so now, since January, I've been sitting on our executive committee firm-wide. So that gives me exposure to what's going on all over the place. And it's been an interesting professional ride.
Well, you see, Eduardo, I see a pattern. You're the type of individual that gets thrown in the middle of the ocean, and you find a way to find land, just like you did with Dartmouth, and just like you're doing now in France. So I see that pattern. So as we wrap up this podcast, I wonder if you have any final thoughts about, maybe somebody in high school was watching this podcast, or maybe somebody who's about to graduate and thinking, how do I optimize my Dartmouth experience? What are the final golden nuggets of wisdom you would share?
I think it's get out of your comfort zone, number one, and challenge yourself. Consider the source. Don't just, think for yourself. Learn to think for yourself. Sometimes that's harder than you think. Going against the grain and going against the tide. It takes some courage. I think another thing that goes with that, though, is you don't need to have an opinion about everything, right? And you certainly, there's no life and death decision based on your opinion on a matter. So pick your battles. If you're passionate about something, and you want to weigh in, consider the forum as well. I mean, your Facebook post is probably not going to sway anybody, right? So is it just pissing in the wind? Let's use the expression of the image. But yeah, I think, wherever you are, if you're there's probably a good reason for you being there. And so with that, you shouldn't have any chip on your shoulder, right? Like I always say, I couldn't get into Dartmouth today. I couldn't get into NYU Law today. I couldn't get hired by Wilkie today, and I certainly couldn't make partner at Wilkie today. But as a matter of fact, I am where I am. And so now all those good things align. I do what I can, and I shouldn't be, and that's the one thing is have the self-confidence. You don't need to be cocky. You don't need to be presumptuous and pretentious and all that, but say, hey, if I'm here, there's a reason for it, and certainly take advantage of it. Youth is wasted on the young. There's plenty of things I should have done while I was there that I didn't do. Those were, choices that sometimes they were not the best. But I would say just challenge yourself, do things, find and the one cliche that I would like to tell people to be careful with is um, find your passion and follow your passion. No. Unless you have the means to do that. Find something you're pretty good at. Work really, really hard. Get lucky that you find people who extend the hand, and then you'll become passionate about that, right? Because if you get to be good at something, and figure out what your skill sets are and where you're weak, and strengthen your weakness, and then you can always change. And I think as a younger people, I'm getting up there in the 50s now. So I have kids that are in their 20s, and their world is very different, and they will bounce around much more. I've been very steady in
Yeah.
both what I'm doing and where I'm doing it, but they will bounce around. But at the end of the day, just figure out what your skills are, figure out what the threats to your livelihood are, and adapt.
Yeah.
And not this, the world has enough actors, enough poets, unless you're really talented. And if you're really talented, the world will find you.
That's right. That's right.
Get a job and focus on that, and be as good as you can possibly be at whatever it is you're doing. And then you'll find that it's rewarding, and also be purposeful in everything you do. And if you're out of Dartmouth or a similar institution, consider yourself extremely lucky. Be very grateful that you're there and do something with it. And that can be just helping out the kids that are in high school or grade school. You may not know it, but you're actually a role model already.
Yeah. No, I think your comments remind me so much of what my abuelo, my grandfather, used to say. Don't be led by your passions, because they change with las diferentes temporadas de la vida, right? The different stages of life. Be led by opportunity. If you see an opportunity, take it and put all your passion into the opportunity and make it work. So
Exactly.
much of what you're saying, resonates with. It's solid advice as compared to the this YOLO advice that a lot of see the younger generation getting. Is like,
So decisions based on passionate or emotional reactions are rarely good ones. Because you haven't
and they're
really thought.
temporary.
By definition, passion fades,
Yeah.
excitement fades, and then you're stuck with the consequences of those actions. But again, I think be active, do things, and try to live a purposeful life. And if you find purpose in what you're doing, and try to contribute to something, the happiness will come along. That's the other thing, is everyone wants to be happy. And I remember having a conversation with my father, because when I was in law school, I thought, I should do public interest work. I was really passionate about all these things, or these movements, all these injustices in the world, and I was going to go out and solve them, right? And he said something that really, sparked a light. He said, well, your sister and me, we're both members of the public, so why don't you do something in our interest? So there you go. That's I think those are words to live by. Do what you can for your immediate circle, and then the bigger circles around there.
That's beautiful. That is beautiful. Oye, Eduardo, thank you so much for spending some time with all of us and sharing your journey and your progression, and just have you connected the dots. For everybody who join us online, thank you for joining this episode of Around the Girdle Earth. If today's conversation sparked a memory or gave you something to think about, please leave us a thoughtful reflection in the comment section. And more importantly, share this episode with a classmate or another fellow alum. That will be a very easy way to keep the Dartmouth spirit alive in this chaotic digital age. So until next time, carry the spirit of the Lone Pine, the echoes of the Baker Tower bells, and may your adventures stretch as far as the hills are green. Thank you, everybody.